The forest seemed alive under the pale light of the moon, its towering pines swaying with a wind we couldn't feel, branches scratched against one another like claws, whispering secrets to the darkness. We shouldn't have been there. Even before the first strange sound pierced the quiet, I felt it in my bones. Something about the air was wrong. Too thick, too heavy, as though the trees themselves were watching, waiting for us to make a mistake. Still, we pressed on, cameras rolling. The others chatted nervously, their voices too loud, their laughter forced. No one wanted to admit they felt the same pressure, the same unease I did. The crunch of leaves beneath our boots seemed deafening, each step dragging us deeper into a silence that grew heavier with every passing minute. Then we reached the edge of the lake. The water was impossibly still, a glassy black mirror reflecting the twisted canopy above. No ripples disturbed its surface, not even from the faint breeze brushing against my face. The moonlight hit it at an odd angle, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch out toward us, beckoning. My throat tightened as I stared at the water, my fingers instinctively gripping the strap of my camera. It was colder here, unnaturally so, like stepping into a room where something terrible had just happened. Behind me, the others were unpacking gear, their voices muted, their movements slower now. It was as if they felt it too, though none of us dared to say it out loud. The plan was simple. Get some initial footage of the lake, capture the atmosphere, and record a few interviews about the legend of the cursed waters. Then we'd retreat to the camp, would set up a mile back, and return in the morning. At least, that was the plan. The first sound came just as I was adjusting my camera. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a high-pitched hum that seemed to vibrate in the air itself. I froze, my hands stilling on the lens as I tilted my head, trying to place it. It wasn't coming from the lake, nor the forest. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, a noise that made the tiny hairs on my neck stand on end. No one else seemed to notice it at first. Sarah was kneeling near the water's edge, holding a microphone just above the surface. Her blonde hair gleamed in the moonlight as she leaned closer, her attention fixed on the still water. Jake was behind her, muttering something about the lighting being too dim, his flashlight casting jittery beams across the shoreline. Lisa and Ben were farther back, setting up the portable tripod and arguing over the best angle. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask if anyone else heard the sound, but before the words could leave my lips, it stopped, just vanished. The sudden absence of it was almost worse than the noise itself, leaving an echo in my skull that made me feel slightly off balance. Then Sarah screamed. It wasn't a scream of surprise or frustration. It was raw, primal, the kind of sound that freezes your blood. My head snapped toward her just in time to see her stumble backward from the lake, her hands clawing at her ears. Her mic fell into the water with a soft plop, and the surface rippled for the first time, the black water churning unnaturally, as if something beneath it had been disturbed. "What is it?" I heard Jake's voice, distant and muffled as though we were underwater. Sarah didn't respond. She just kept shaking her head, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Blah. I started toward her, my feet crunching over the frost-laced leaves. But something stopped me. It wasn't fear. It was instinct. The same gut-deep warning that had been screaming at me since we entered the forest. She turned to face me then, and a look in her eyes made my stomach drop. They were wide, unblinking, her pupils blown wide enough to swallow the pale blue of her irises. She mouthed something, but no sound came out. Her hands moved to her throat, clutching at it as though she couldn't breathe, and she stumbled toward me. Behind her, the water rippled again, and this time, the movement didn't stop. It spread outward in concentric circles, the surface buckling and churning as though something massive was rising from below. "Sarah!" I finally found my voice, but it felt weak, hollow, swallowed by the oppressive silence that had fallen over the lake. She collapsed before I could reach her, her body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Jake rushed past me, dropping to his knees beside her. But even as he shook her, I knew it was useless. Her eyes were still open, staring into nothing, her chest unnaturally still. The lake had gone silent again, the ripples fading as quickly as they'd appeared. I turned to look at the others. Lisa and Ben stood frozen, their faces pale, their eyes locked on Sarah's still form. And then we heard it, a laugh. Soft, almost gentle, but layered with something that made my skin crawl. It came from the water, or maybe the trees. I couldn't tell. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. And it was followed by a whisper, a single word, too faint to make out, but heavy with meaning. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees leaning closer, their branches entwining above like a cage. The air grew colder still, frost creeping across the ground in jagged patterns. "We have to leave," Lisa's voice broke the spell, sharp and urgent. No, I didn't need convincing. None of us did. Jake and Ben lifted Sarah's body, their faces pale and set, and we began to move. But every step felt harder than the last, as though the ground itself was trying to hold us back. The laughter followed us, growing softer, more distant, but never truly fading. And as we stumbled through the dark, I made the mistake of looking back. The lake was still again, its surface smooth and untouched. But standing at the edge, where Sarah had knelt just moments before, was a figure, tall, gaunt, and cloaked in shadow. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly, as though watching us leave. I turned back around and ran. The forest swallowed us whole as we stumbled away from the lake, Sarah's lifeless body cradled between Jake and Ben. The air grew thicker with every step, the chill biting deeper into my skin as if the woods themselves were trying to keep us from escaping. I could hear Lisa's ragged breathing ahead of me, her flashlight swinging wildly, casting chaotic shadows that seemed to move on their own. None of us spoke. What could we say? Every sound felt like an invitation for something to follow, to finish what had started. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, what we'd all seen. But there was no sense to it. The figure at the lake's edge, the way the water had rippled like it was alive. The sound of that laugh. None of it should have been real, and yet it was. Ambiance. Sarah was gone. I couldn't stop replaying the look in her eyes, the way they had frozen wide open, staring at nothing. It wasn't natural. It wasn't just fear or pain. It was as though something had taken her, pulled her out of herself, leaving behind an empty shell. I wanted to believe there was still a chance that she wasn't really gone. But the stillness of her body said otherwise. The path we'd taken to the lake seemed unrecognizable now, twisted and unfamiliar. Trees that should have marked our way back to camp leaned at impossible angles, their branches gnarled and clawing at the sky. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy, almost alive, and every step sent a faint shiver through the earth. "We're close," Ben muttered under his breath, though I wasn't sure if he was trying to convince us or himself. His voice was strained, hoarse from the cold, and from whatever had wrapped itself around us since the lake. But we weren't close. The camp should have been a straight shot back, 15, maybe 20 minutes at most. But the forest seemed to stretch on forever, bending and looping back on itself. My watch told me we'd been walking for nearly an hour. But we'd seen no signs of our tents, no evidence that we were heading in the right direction. Lisa was the first to stop. Anissa, stop. She turned sharply, her flashlight beam catching my face and making me squint. "This isn't right," she said, her voice shaking. "We should have been back by now." Jake let out a sharp breath, setting Sarah's body down gently against a tree. "Yeah, no kidding. This whole damn place isn't right." His hands were shaking as he wiped them on his jacket, smearing Sarah's blood, or whatever had come from her, across the fabric. "What the hell is going on?" No one answered. We all felt it, the wrongness of the air, the way the trees seemed to breathe, the faint whispers that had followed us since we'd left the lake. I hadn't said anything about them, hoping they were just my imagination, but now I wasn't so sure. Ben knelt beside Sarah, his flashlight trained on her pale face. "We can't keep carrying her like this. We need to figure something out." His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked away, his jaw clenched. Lisa turned in a slow circle, her flashlight beam dancing over the trees. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her words barely audible. I froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the sound of our breathing and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. But then, faint and distant, came the sound of footsteps. They weren't ours. They were too slow, too deliberate, crunching through the underbrush in a steady rhythm that didn't belong in a place like this. Jake heard it too. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. He grabbed his flashlight, spinning in place. But the beam revealed nothing but empty forest. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, none of us moved. The air around us felt heavier, colder, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and refuses to leave. Then the laughter came again, soft, almost playful, drifting through the trees like a melody carried on the wind. "Stop," Lisa whispered, clutching at her head as if the sound was inside her skull. "Ow, just stop." The laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, overlapping with itself, until it was no longer a single voice, but a chorus. Male, female, young, old. It was everyone and no one, and it surrounded us completely. The flashlights began to flicker, the beams dimming and brightening, as though the batteries were draining all at once. "We need to move," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound steady. "We need to get out of here now." But the path ahead was gone. Where there should have been a trail, there was only dense undergrowth, the trees pressing closer together, as if to block our way. Behind us, the footsteps resumed, louder and faster, crunching toward us at an unnatural speed. Ben grabbed Sarah's body, hoisting her over his shoulder despite the strain, and we started running. The forest seemed to twist and shift around us, the branches reaching out like fingers to snag at our clothes, our hair. The laughter followed, rising to a deafening pitch, the footsteps pounding behind us like a drumbeat. I don't know how long we ran. Time felt meaningless in that place, stretched and warped by the oppressive darkness. All I knew was the sound of my own breathing, the sting of branches cutting across my skin, and the growing certainty that we were being herded, pushed back toward the lake. And then the trees parted, and we were there. The lake lay before us, its surface smooth and undisturbed, reflecting the moonlight like polished glass. But the figure was gone. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving an echo in my ears that made me feel sick. We stood at the water's edge, gasping for breath, the silence pressing down on us like a physical weight. Sarah's body lay limp in Ben's arms, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was heavier now, as though something unseen had claimed her. The whispers began again, soft and insidious, their words just out of reach. I turned toward the others, but the look in their eyes told me they heard it too. The air was thick with tension, with the promise of something we couldn't yet see. And then, from the center of the lake, came a ripple. The ripple in the lake's surface spread slowly, unnaturally, distorting the perfect reflection of the moon. My breath caught as the water quivered, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to echo the faint thrum in the back of my mind. None of us moved. None of us spoke. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to emerge. The ripple grew larger, concentric circles radiating outward in perfect symmetry. And then the water began to churn, not violently, but deliberately, as though stirred by an unseen hand. The reflection of the moon shattered, fragments of light dancing across the rippling surface before vanishing into the depths. The air was colder now, the kind of chill that seeped through skin and bone and settled in your soul. Ben shifted uneasily, adjusting Sarah's limp body on his shoulder. The sound of his movement snapped me out of my trance, and I tore my gaze away from the lake, glancing at the others. Lisa stood frozen, her eyes wide, her lips moving soundlessly. Jake's flashlight was shaking in his hand, the beam darting erratically across the shoreline. "We have to go," I whispered, though my voice felt thin and fragile against the weight of the night. No, but the lake didn't let us. Only while too soon, the lake east. The water surged upward, not in waves, but in shapes, elongated, twisted forms that defied logic. It was like watching liquid come alive, pulling itself into shadows that shouldn't exist. Tendrils of black water stretched toward the shore, reaching out with slow, deliberate movements, as if searching for something or someone. Lisa let out a sharp gasp, stumbling back and nearly tripping over a root. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft, wet sound of the lake's movements. I didn't answer. There was nothing I could say. My mind raced for an explanation, but there was none. This wasn't natural. This wasn't something we were meant to see, let alone survive. One of the water shadows moved closer, its amorphous form rippling and shifting as it slid onto the shore. It didn't drip or pool, it simply existed, a piece of the lake that had decided it no longer belonged to the water. The tendril hesitated, as if tasting the air, and then it lunged. Jake screamed as the shadow wrapped itself around his ankle, pulling him off his feet with a force that sent him crashing to the ground. His flashlight flew from his hand, spinning end over end, before landing in the shallows, its beam flickering weakly against the darkness. He clawed at the dirt, his nails digging into the earth as the shadow dragged him closer to the water. "Help me," he choked, his voice cracking with panic. Ben was the first to move. Annie. He dropped Sarah's body with a sickening thud and lunged toward Jake, grabbing his arm and pulling with all his strength. But the shadow was relentless, its liquid form solid and unyielding, inching Jake closer to the lake despite Ben's effort. I grabbed a branch from the ground, the rough bark biting into my palms. As I swung it at the shadow, it passed through with no resistance, like slicing through smoke. The tendril didn't even falter. If anything, it seemed stronger now, as though our efforts to fight back only fed it. Lisa stumbled forward, her face pale and slick with sweat. "Stop!" she shouted, though it wasn't clear if she was talking to us or the shadow. She grabbed Jake's other arm, her nails digging into his skin as she pulled. The three of us strained against the thing, our combined weight barely slowing its progress. Jake's screams grew louder, more frantic, and then, without warning, they stopped. His body went rigid, his head snapping back unnaturally as his mouth opened in a silent gasp. Ah! The shadow released him, retreating back into the lake with a wet, slithering sound. For a moment, Jake just lay there, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and unfocused. Then he sat up slowly, his movements stiff and mechanical, like a marionette on strings. "Jake?" Ben asked, his voice hesitant, filled with a fear we all share. Jake didn't respond. He turned his head toward us, his eyes catching the moonlight. And that's when I saw it. His pupils were gone, replaced by an inky blackness that seemed to swirl and shift, as if the lake had left a piece of itself inside him. His lips curled into a smile, wide and unnatural, his teeth glinting in the dim light. "They're waiting," he said, his voice layered, as though someone or something was speaking through him. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. Ben reached for him, but I grabbed his arm, shaking my head. Whatever Jake was now, it wasn't Jake. The ground beneath us trembled, a low rumble that vibrated through my bones. The lake surface rippled violently, and more tendrils began to rise, their movements faster, more purposeful. It was no longer just reaching. It was coming for us. "Run!" I shouted, my voice breaking as I turned and bolted into the trees. I didn't wait to see if the others followed. The only thought in my mind was to get as far from that lake as possible. Branches tore at my clothes and skin as I ran. The forest a blur of shadows and faint moonlight. The laughter returned, louder and closer, mingling with the sound of the tendrils crashing through the underbrush behind us. It wasn't just coming from the lake anymore. It was all around us, woven into the very fabric of the forest. Lisa's panicked cries echoed somewhere behind me, but I couldn't stop. The ground shifted beneath my feet, roots rising and twisting as though trying to trip me. My lungs burned, my legs screaming in protest. But I pushed on, the primal need to survive overriding everything else. When I finally broke through the tree line, I collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for breath. The laughter was quieter here, more distant, but it hadn't stopped. It never stopped. Ben emerged a moment later, dragging a shell-shocked Lisa behind him. Sarah's body was gone, and Jake hadn't made it out. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. But the forest felt different now. Every step forward brought with it the sensation that the trees were leaning in closer, their gnarled branches intertwining above us, blocking out the faint moonlight that had been our only guide. The air was heavier, thick with a damp chill that seemed to seep through my skin and settle deep in my bones. Each breath felt like dragging in smoke, suffocating and cloying. Ben was the first to speak. Since we'd stumbled out of the tree line, his voice was raw, barely more than a whisper. "Jake, he couldn't finish. None of us could." Lisa was huddled against the base of a tree, her knees drawn to her chest, her flashlight clutched so tightly in her hands that her knuckles were white. She hadn't said a word since we'd stopped, and her eyes were fixed on the ground as if looking up would force her to acknowledge what had happened. I couldn't sit still. Eerie. My legs were shaking, my hands numb, but I forced myself to pace the small clearing. The act of moving, of doing something, was the only thing keeping me from completely unraveling. The whispers hadn't followed us here. Not yet, but their absence felt wrong. It was as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to exhale. "We have to get out of here," I said, breaking the silence. My voice sounded foreign, too loud against the oppressive quiet. "We can't stay here." Ben looked up at me, his face pale, streaked with dirt, and something darker. His expression was blank, his eyes hollow. "And go where? Every path leads back to that." I didn't have an answer. The thought of moving forward felt impossible. But staying here felt worse. The shadows around us seemed to shift and ripple, dancing at the edges of the clearing like they were alive. My grip tightened on the branch I'd picked up earlier. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Lisa finally spoke, her voice trembling and barely audible. "Did you hear him?" Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, wide and glassy. When he said they're waiting, I didn't respond. I couldn't. I'd heard it, and the words were still echoing in my mind, twisting themselves into something darker. They weren't just waiting. They were watching, guiding us like pawns in a game we didn't understand. Ben shook his head, his hands gripping his knees. "And you, Sybil, this doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense. We have to find the camp. If we can get back to the gear, maybe we can signal for help. A flare, the radio, something." The mention of the camp sparked a faint hope, though it was quickly smothered by the memory of the paths twisting and turning, leading us back to the lake, no matter which direction we took. But what choice did we have? Staying here would only delay the inevitable. We moved as a group, sticking close together as we pushed through the underbrush. The forest seemed darker now, the trees denser, their branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy overhead. The flashlight beams cut weakly through the gloom, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself was resisting our movement. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to glance back at the shadows that I knew were following us. They weren't loud. No footsteps, no rustling leaves. Just the oppressive sensation of being watched, their presence pressing against the back of my neck like cold fingers. As we walked, the forest began to change. The trees grew twisted, their bark blackened and gnarled, and the ground beneath us softened, sinking slightly under our weight. The air was different here, sharp and acrid, carrying with it the faint stench of decay. Then we saw it, a structure rising out of the darkness, half hidden by the trees. It was small, decrepit, its wooden walls sagging with age and rot. The windows were broken, their jagged edges glinting faintly in the flashlight beams, and the door hung crooked on rusted hinges. "A cabin," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not the camp, but maybe." Ben didn't wait for her to finish. He moved toward the building, his steps quick and determined, as though he were afraid he'd lose his nerve if he hesitated. I followed, every muscle in my body taut, my makeshift weapon held tightly in my hands. The interior was worse than the outside. The air was thick with dust and mildew, the floorboards warped and creaking under our weight. Broken furniture lay scattered across the room, and the walls were covered in deep scratches, as though something had clawed at them in desperation. In the center of the room was a table, its surface littered with papers and objects I couldn't immediately identify. Ben approached the table, his flashlight beam sweeping over its surface. "What is this?" he muttered, more to himself than to us. I stepped closer, my heart sinking as I took in the objects. "You in the box," a rusted knife, a shattered lantern, and a book with its cover worn and stained. The pages were yellowed, filled with handwritten notes and sketches that made my stomach turn. They depicted the lake, the tendrils, the shadows, everything we'd seen, and more. There were symbols, too, scrolled across the margins, their jagged lines pulsing faintly in the dim light. Lisa reached out to touch the book, but I grabbed her wrist. "Don't," I said, my voice harsher than I intended. "We don't know what it is." "It's a journal," Ben said, flipping through the pages carefully. His voice was tense, his eyes scanning the text with growing unease. Whoever wrote this, they knew. They knew what was out there. He stopped on a page, near the end, his flashlight illuminating a single sentence scrawled in shaky handwriting. "The lake doesn't let you leave. It takes you piece by piece." A loud crash came from outside, shattering the fragile calm. The three of us froze, our breath hitching as the sound echoed through the cabin. The shadows beyond the broken windows seemed to writhe, pressing closer, and the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. They weren't just outside. They were inside too. The whispers grew louder, rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to match the frantic beating of my heart. They weren't words, not entirely, just fragments of sound layered over each other. A haunting melody that wormed its way into my thoughts. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, thicker, like the atmosphere was pressing down on us from all sides. The walls seemed to shift, the scratches etched into the wood, shimmering faintly as though reacting to the noise. Ben was the first to move, slamming the journal shut and clutching it tightly in his hands. "We need to leave," he said, his voice barely audible over the whispers. "Whatever this is, it doesn't want us here." Lisa stood frozen near the window, her flashlight beam trembling as it cut across the room. "It's everywhere," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They're inside." "How are they inside?" I gripped the branch tighter, the rough bark digging into my palms. And my knuckles were white, my breath shallow and uneven. I didn't want to look, but my eyes were drawn to the shadows pooling at the edges of the room, their shapes shifting and curling like smoke. They weren't natural. They weren't real, but they were there, crawling closer with every flicker of the failing light. The crash outside came again, louder this time, closer. The cabin shuddered under the force of it, the floorboards creaking as though something massive had pressed against the walls. Lisa stumbled back from the window with a startled cry, her flashlight clattering to the floor and rolling to a stop. Its beam illuminated a sliver of the outside world, where the shadows danced and twisted, more alive than ever. Ben grabbed my arm, his grip firm and urgent. "We have to move, now." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and turned toward the door. But as I stepped forward, the whispers surged, their voices merging into a deafening roar. The shadows lunged, stretching across the floor with impossible speed, their dark tendrils reaching for us. I swung the branch instinctively, the motion clumsy and desperate, but it passed through the darkness without resistance. The tendrils didn't stop, curling around my legs, my arms, my throat. The cold was immediate, searing and biting like frostburn. My vision blurred, the room spinning as the shadows tightened their grip. I gasped, clawing at the air, my chest heaving as panic overtook me. Somewhere in the haze, I heard Lisa screaming, Ben shouting, the cabin erupting into chaos. The journal hit the floor with a dull thud, its pages flipping wildly, as though caught in a sudden wind. And then, as quickly as it started, the shadows recoiled. They slithered back into the corners of the room, melting into the cracks and crevices like oil. The whispers faded to a low hum, and the air grew still once more. I collapsed to my knees, my limbs trembling, my breath ragged. What just happened?" Lisa stammered, her voice shaking. "Gah." She was huddled against the wall, her eyes darting to every shadow like they might lunge at her again. Ben didn't answer. He was staring at the journal, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he picked it up, his hands shaking as he flipped to the page he'd been reading before. His flashlight cast long shadows across the text, the words jagged and uneven, scrawled in a hand that spoke of desperation. "It's not just the lake," he said finally, his voice hollow. "It's the forest, the shadows, they're all connected. They feed off of us." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What do you mean, feed?" Ben turned the journal toward us, pointing to a passage near the bottom of the page. The words were smeared, barely legible, but one sentence stood out, underlined in thick, frantic strokes. "They take pieces of you until there's nothing left." A chill ran down my spine, colder than the shadow's touch. I could feel it already, the emptiness creeping in, the parts of me that didn't feel entirely my own anymore. My thoughts were sluggish, fragmented, as though something had reached inside my mind and rearranged the pieces. Before anyone could speak, the door slammed open, the force of it sending a gust of icy air through the room. The shadows outside surged forward, pouring into the cabin like a living tide. The walls groaned, the scratches glowing faintly as the darkness consumed the space. Ben grabbed my arm again, pulling me toward the door. "Envelop, go!" he shouted, his voice breaking through the roar of the shadows. "We can't stay here." I didn't hesitate. Lisa scrambled to her feet, and the three of us bolted from the cabin, the shadows snapping at our heels. The forest outside was worse than before, the trees leaning in closer, their branches clawing at us as we ran. The whispers had returned, louder now, more frantic, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that made it impossible to think. I didn't know where we were going. I didn't care. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between us and the cabin. The lake, the shadows. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I pushed forward, the primal need to survive overriding everything else. Behind me, I heard Lisa cry out, her footsteps faltering. I turned just in time to see her stumble, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and tumbling into the underbrush. She fell hard, her hands clawing at the dirt as she tried to scramble to her feet. The shadows were on her before I could move. "You will Henny," before I could move. "Lisa," I shouted, reaching out, but Ben grabbed me, pulling me back. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "You can't," he said, his voice shaking. "We can't save her." I struggled against his grip, my mind screaming at me to help her, to do something. But he was right. The shadows enveloped her, their darkness swallowing her whole. Her screams echoed through the forest, then abruptly cut off, leaving only silence. Ben didn't let go of me until we reached another clearing, the shadows retreating as though satisfied with their prize. I collapsed onto the ground, my chest heaving, my mind reeling. Lisa was gone. Jake was gone. And the forest wasn't done with us. Bubei, el, say, anitiwite, gada. But the clearing was a small reprieve, but it felt like a cruel joke. The trees circled us tightly, their blackened branches reaching out as if they might close in at any moment. The air was cold and heavy, each breath sharp against my lungs, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood and decay. Ben and I sat in silence, the weight of Lisa's absence crushing down on us. She was gone, just like Jake, just like Sarah. The shadows had taken her, and we had done nothing. I couldn't bring myself to look at Ben. His face was a mask of blank terror, his jaw tight, his eyes staring at something I couldn't see. Maybe he was replaying it in his mind, the way the shadows had surged over Lisa, swallowing her screams whole. Maybe he was already trying to calculate our chances of surviving whatever this was. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to know the answer. The journal lay between us on the ground, its edges warped and stained from the chaos of the cabin. The words inside it were burned into my memory. They take pieces of you until there's nothing left. I could feel it. Something missing. Something stolen. But I couldn't put my finger on what it was. My thoughts felt sluggish. like they were trying to move through thick fog. Even my own memories seemed blurred. Edges frayed as if they'd been tampered with. Ben's voice finally broke the silence. Low and strained. We can't just sit here. His hands trembled as he reached for the journal, flipping through its fragile pages with an urgency that bordered on desperation. There has to be something. A way to stop this. A way to... He didn't finish the sentence, and he didn't need to. We both knew what he was hoping for. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What does it say? The words felt foreign on my tongue, like they didn't belong to me. Ben paused, his fingers lingering on a page near the back. The writing there was messier, frantic, the letters slanting and jagged. It talks about the lake, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. About something that lives in it, a keeper. It doesn't just guard the lake, it is the lake. The words sent a chill down my spine. What does that mean? I asked, though I wasn't sure. I wanted to hear the answer. Ben didn't let me. He kept reading, his brow furrowed, his breathing shallow. It says the keeper is ancient, older than the forest, older than anything we can imagine. It feeds on us, but not just our bodies. It takes everything, our memories, our fears, our guilt. It consumes who we are. The fog in my mind grew thicker, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I thought of Lisa, her wide, terrified eyes as the shadows took her. I thought of Jake, his voice layered with something that wasn't his own. I thought of Sarah, her empty, lifeless gaze, staring up at the sky. Were they all gone now, or were they still here, trapped in the lake, in the forest, in the shadows? Ben slammed the journal shut, his movements abrupt and jarring. There's a way, he said, his voice shaking. It's dangerous, but it's the only chance we have. What is it? I asked, my heart pounding. He hesitated, his hands gripping the edges of the journal so tightly, his knuckles turned white. The keeper has a core, he said finally. A source of power. If we destroy it, we can stop this. We can break the connection. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Where's the core? I asked, though I already knew the answer. But the lake. It always came back to the lake. Ben nodded, his face pale. It's at the bottom of the lake. That's what the journal says. But... Enu viewed me. His voice faltered, and he looked away. It says the shadows will do everything they can to stop us. They're part of the keeper. They'll fight to protect it. I felt a deep, sinking dread settle in my chest. The shadows had already taken so much from us. How could we possibly fight them? How could we destroy something that had existed longer than we could comprehend? But there was no other option. If we didn't try, we would die here, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of us. The keeper would win. and we would become part of the forest, part of the lake, part of the whispers that lured others into the same trap. Ben stood, his movements stiff and jerky, and tucked the journal into his jacket. "We need to move," he said, his voice firmer now, though his hands were still trembling. "If we stay here, it'll find us." I nodded, pushing myself to my feet, despite the ache in my legs, and the exhaustion that threatened to drag me back down. The forest loomed around us, darker than ever, the path ahead uncertain. But there was no turning back. The lake was waiting. The keeper was waiting. Noel, the kings, and we were running out of time. The lake loomed before us, impossibly still and suffocatingly silent. The air was heavier now, thick with a presence that seemed to press down on my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness that swallowed the shoreline. Beside me, Ben clutched the journal, like it was the only thing keeping him grounded, his face pale and drawn, his breaths shallow. We stood at the edge of the water, and for a moment neither of us moved. The surface of the lake reflected nothing. It was a void, endless and impenetrable. Somewhere deep inside me, a primal instinct screamed to turn back, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows would find us. They always did. Ben broke the silence first. "The journal says we have to dive," he said, his voice flat, hollow. "The core is at the bottom. It's the only way." I stared at the water, my stomach churning. Dive into that, into whatever waited below. My mind raced with visions of the tendrils that had dragged Jake into the depths. The way the lake had seemed alive, malevolent. "And then what?" I asked, my voice trembling. How do we destroy it?" Ben flipped open the journal, his hands shaking so badly the pages rustled loudly in the stillness. "It doesn't say," he admitted after a moment, his voice barely audible. "But I think we'll know when we see it." It wasn't an answer, but I didn't press him. What was the point? We were already in this nightmare, and the only way out was forward or down. I stepped into the water first, the icy cold slicing through me like a knife. My breath hitched as the chill seeped into my bones, but I forced myself to keep moving, wading deeper until the water reached my waist. Behind me, I heard Ben take a shaky breath and follow, his steps slow and deliberate. The lake's surface rippled faintly around us, though there was no wind, no current. It was as if the water itself was watching, waiting. When we were chest deep, Ben stopped. "It's going to fight us," he said, his voice unsteady. "The shadows, the whispers, they're all part of it. They won't let us do this." I nodded, unable to speak. I didn't need him to tell me. I could feel it already, a rising pressure, a weight in the air that made every movement feel like I was dragging myself through quicksand. My head throbbed with the faint echo of whispers, just out of reach, but growing louder with every passing second. Ben looked at me, his expression grim. "On 3, he said. "We go under together." I nodded again, tightening my grip on the flashlight, though I knew it wouldn't last long underwater. Ben counted down, his voice shaking, but resolute. 1, 2, 3. We dove. The cold was immediate and all-encompassing, stealing the air from my lungs in a sharp, burning rush. The water was impossibly dark, my flashlight's beam cutting only a few feet ahead before dissolving into blackness. I kicked downward, forcing myself deeper despite the panic clawing at the edges of my mind. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a maddening chorus. I glanced back to see Ben just behind me, his face pale and strained in the faint light of his own flashlight. He gestured downward, his movements sluggish, as though the water itself was trying to hold him back. I nodded and kept going, my chest tightening as the pressure built around me. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a faint glow in the distance, a sickly yellow light that pulsed rhythmically, like the beat of a heart. But as we descended further, the source came into view, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a mass, a twisted, writhing thing of flesh and shadow, its surface covered in jagged, pulsating veins that glowed faintly with that same yellow light. Tendrils of darkness radiated out from it, undulating in the water like they were alive. The core. Ben caught up to me, his eyes wide with terror as he took in the sight. He gestured frantically, pointing to a section of the mass where the light was brightest. I understood immediately. That was the heart of it, the place where we had to strike. But as we moved closer, the tendrils reacted. They surged toward us, moving with a speed and precision that defied the water's resistance. I swung my flashlight instinctively, the beam slicing through the dark, but doing nothing to stop the tendrils. One wrapped around my ankle, its grip cold and unyielding, pulling me backward with a force that sent me tumbling. My flashlight spun out of my hand, disappearing into the void. Ben lunged toward me, his own flashlight in one hand, the other clutching at the tendril around my leg. He pulled with all his strength, and for a moment it worked. The tendril loosened its grip, retreating back toward the core. But it was only a moment. More tendrils surged forward, wrapping around both of us, dragging us closer to the writhing mass. The whispers were deafening now, their words incomprehensible, but filled with malice. My vision blurred, the pressure in my chest unbearable as the tendrils tightened their grip. I clawed at the water, at the tendrils, at anything I could reach, but it was useless. And then did something I didn't expect. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the journal, holding it aloft as though it were a shield. The tendrils recoiled instantly, hissing and writhing as though the sight of the book burned them. The core pulsed violently, its light flickering, and for a brief moment the grip around me loosened. Ben shoved the journal into my hands, his eyes locking on mine. I shook my head, trying to understand, but he pushed me away, his expression resolute. "Go," he mouthed, his lips forming the word with an urgency that broke my heart. Before I could stop him, he turned and dove straight toward the core, the tendrils closing in around him like a net. I screamed, bubbles erupting from my mouth, but the sound was lost in the chaos. Ben reached the core and slammed the journal against its surface, the light flaring so brightly it blinded me. The last thing I saw was his face, calm and determined, as the core began to fracture, its light consuming everything around it. Then the water erupted in a shock wave, and the world went dark. I woke up on the shore, gasping for air, the forest silent and still. Ben was gone. Woman, Taulil, TV. The lake was calm. It was calm, and I was alone. The air inside the hospital was suffocating, thick with a staleness that clung to my skin like a second layer. Every step echoed through the endless halls, bouncing back at us in uneven, hollow waves. The beams of our flashlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating peeling wallpaper, broken tiles, and medical equipment left to rust and rot. The walls seemed to close in as we moved deeper, their surfaces streaked with water stains that resembled hands clawing their way down. The entrance had been deceptively mundane, just a heavy metal door hanging on broken hinges, groaning as we pushed it open. Now, standing in the long corridor, the normal world felt like it was miles away. The faint metallic tang of decay filled my nose, mingling with the scent of old, damp wood. The faint hum of our camera gear was the only sound apart from our breathing. I led the way, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. My pulse quickened with every step, though I tried to shake it off as adrenaline. There was no reason to be afraid. Not yet. The stories we'd heard, the patients, the experiments, the disappearances, they were just that. Stories. Urban legends. Meant to keep people like us away. That's what I told myself. Anyway. We reached the first major intersection in the hallway, where a rusted wheelchair sat askew, one wheel tilted at an unnatural angle. I slowed, the beam of my light catching on the faded paint of a sign mounted crookedly on the wall. Ward C, observation, was printed in blocky letters, but most of the words had been worn away, the remaining fragments just scratches on the surface. The arrow underneath pointed left, into a corridor that disappeared into darkness. Something about that hallway made my skin crawl. The air there seemed thicker, heavier, and colder. My gut twisted, as if it knew what my mind wouldn't acknowledge yet. That hallway was wrong. I wasn't ready to admit it out loud, though, so I gestured forward, trying to keep my voice steady. The others followed close behind, their footfalls crunching softly on broken glass and debris. The tension in the group was palpable, a fragile silence stretched thin. The further we went, the stranger the space felt. The floor tiles here were cleaner somehow, their surfaces marred less by grime and more by long, deliberate scratches that crisscrossed in irregular patterns. The fluorescent lights overhead were dead, but some flickered faintly, casting sporadic, sickly glows that only seemed to deepen the shadow. As we moved deeper, I became aware of a faint noise, just at the edge of hearing. It wasn't the low hum of our equipment or the shuffle of our feet. It was softer, more rhythmic, a tapping, faint and uneven, like someone drumming their fingers on metal. It was so subtle that I thought I'd imagined it at first, but it grew louder as we pressed on, echoing faintly down the hall. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling, or maybe an old pipe reacting to the cold. Still, the knot in my stomach tightened. The tapping stopped abruptly as we approached a set of double doors. Envelop. One of the doors hung open slightly, its hinges rusted and broken. My flashlight caught on a tarnished brass plaque affixed to the wall beside it. Ward C, Isolation. The letters were scratched deeply, jagged lines cutting through the metal like claw marks. Deadway claw marks. A faint smell wafted from beyond the door, sharp and acidic. It was the kind of smell that stuck to the back of your throat, making it hard to breathe. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting one of the others to suggest turning back, but no one spoke. Their faces were pale in the dim light, their eyes wide, but they all looked to me. So I pushed the door open. The room beyond was massive, much larger than I'd expected. Rows of empty hospital beds stretched out in every direction, their frames rusted and sagging. Thin curtains hung between them, the fabric discolored and tattered. My light swept across the room, catching on small, eerie details. A single shoe lying in the middle of the floor, an overturned tray with shattered glass scattered beneath it. A child's doll slumped against the wall, with one eye missing. And then my flashlight stopped. At first I thought it was just another shadow cast by the beams of our lights. But then it moved. Slowly, deliberately. A figure emerged from behind one of the curtains at the far end of the room. It didn't make a sound, its movements unnaturally smooth, almost like it was gliding. My heart pounded in my chest as the flashlight revealed more. A thin, gaunt frame draped in what looked like an old hospital gown. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, as though it was too heavy for its neck to hold up. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure's face was obscured by the shadows, but its eyes, two pinpricks of pale, unnatural light, cut through the darkness like knives. It wasn't looking at me, it was staring past me, down the hallway we'd just come from. And then it turned its head. It didn't move quickly, but there was something horribly wrong about the way it turned, the motion too smooth, too fluid. Its glowing eyes locked onto me, and for a moment I felt like I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The sound of the tapping returned, louder now, echoing around the room in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. The figure stepped forward, the sound of its bare feet against the tile sharp and deliberate. Ah! The others noticed it now, their flashlights converging on the same spot. But the light didn't faze it. It kept coming, slow and steady, each step more deliberate than the last. Move, move, I finally shouted, my voice breaking the spell. I didn't wait to see if they followed. I turned and bolted, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran back through the doors and into the hallway. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, ours, but also something else, something heavier, slower, and unrelenting. The tapping followed us all the way back. The hallway stretched endlessly before us as we ran, the sound of our footsteps echoing loudly in the oppressive silence. Behind us, the tapping followed, relentless and uneven, its rhythm quickening as if it sensed our fear. My flashlight beam bounced wildly with each step, casting jagged shadows that seemed to reach for us from the walls. The air was colder now, thick and biting, as though the building itself was alive and pulling us deeper into its grasp. I glanced back, just for a second. The corridor was dark, but I could see it. The figure, still moving, still coming. It didn't run. It didn't need to. Its slow, deliberate steps seemed to close the distance faster than they should have. Its pale, glowing eyes fixed on us like twin beacons of inevitability. My breath hitched, my chest tightening as I forced myself to look away and keep moving. The others were just ahead of me. Ben was in the lead, his flashlight illuminating the way forward, his steps frantic but determined. Mia clutched her camera to her chest, her face pale and drawn, her lips moving soundlessly as though she were praying. Alan brought up the rear, his eyes darting wildly from side to side, his movements jerky and panicked. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. The hallway twisted sharply to the left, and we nearly collided with each other as we turned. The tapping grew louder, closer, the sound reverberating through the walls like a living thing. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything but the echo of my own panic. The walls seemed to close in, the corridor narrowing with every step, until it felt like we were squeezing through a tunnel. Ben skidded to a stop ahead of us, his flashlight beam catching on something that made him freeze. I stumbled to a halt behind him, nearly crashing into his back. My flashlight followed his, and my stomach lurched. The hallway ended abruptly in a dead end. The wall before us was blank, featureless, its surface covered in peeling paint and jagged cracks. There was no door, no window, no way forward, just a wall. Deep, a cold, suffocating dread settled over me as I turned back, my flashlight beam trembling as I aimed it down the corridor we'd just come from. The figure was there, standing motionless at the far end of the hall. It was closer now, its gaunt, skeletal frame illuminated in stark detail by the weak glow of the flickering lights. Its head tilted to one side, its glowing eyes unblinking as they bore into us. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an even more chilling sound, a faint rasping breath, slow and deliberate, like the exhale of something ancient and patient. "We're trapped," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. She pressed herself against the wall, her knuckles white as she gripped her camera, like it might protect her. Ben's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging us into even deeper darkness. He cursed under his breath, shaking the device violently, as though sheer willpower could bring it back to life. Alan backed away from the dead end, his movements frantic, his flashlight beam shaking wildly. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice rising in pitch. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." The figure moved. It took a single step forward, and the sound of its bare foot against the floor was deafening in the stillness. My entire body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something. But there was nowhere to go. Hey, nowhere to hide. Another step. Dot. The sound was deliberate, echoing through the narrow hallway like the toll of a distant bell. The air grew colder, the faint mist of our breath visible in the weak light of our flashlights. The walls around us seemed to shudder, faint cracks spidering outward from the dead end, their edges glowing faintly with an eerie pale light. "Mia, the camera," Ben said suddenly, his voice sharp and urgent. "Turn it on." "What?" she stammered, her eyes wide with terror. "Just do it," he snapped, his voice cracking. "We need to record this." Mia fumbled with the camera, her hands trembling as she pressed the power button. The faint hum of the device powering on was a stark contrast to the suffocating silence around us. She aimed the lens toward the figure, her breath hitching as she focused on its face, or what should have been its face. The glow of its eyes intensified, casting eerie shadows across its gaunt features. Through the camera's viewfinder, the figure seemed to shift, its edges blurring and distorting like a reflection on rippling water. The faint rasping breath grew louder, joined by a low guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. It wasn't a growl, not exactly, but something far worse, something primal, something wrong. The light in Mia's camera flickered, and her expression changed. She gasped, stepping back as though the viewfinder had shown her something even more horrifying than what we could see. "It's not just one," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's more." My flashlight caught movement behind the figure. The shadows at the far end of the hall were shifting, writhing, coalescing into shapes that defied logic. More figures emerged from the darkness, their glowing eyes piercing the gloom. They moved in unison, their steps slow and synchronized, the sound of their footsteps blending into a chorus of dread. Ben grabbed my arm, his grip tight and desperate. "We need to find another way," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't stay here." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Together, we began to search the walls, running our hands along the cold, crumbling surface, looking for anything. An opening, a crack, a weakness. The figures moved closer, their glowing eyes unblinking, their rasping breaths filling the air. Alan let out a strangled cry, his flashlight dropping to the floor with a clatter. He pressed himself against the dead end, his hands clawing at the wall, as though he could dig his way through. "They're coming," he sobbed, his voice breaking. "We're going to die here." "Where is your life from?" I refused to give in to the panic, though it clawed at the edges of my mind. There had to be a way out. There had to be. My fingers brushed against something, a seam in the wall, faint and almost imperceptible. I pressed harder, feeling the edges give slightly beneath my touch. "Eerie," I shouted, my voice hoarse. "There's something here." Ben was at my side in an instant, helping me push against the seam. Oh. The wall groaned, the cracks spreading, the pale light seeping through like a wound. The figures were closer now, their shadows stretching toward us like reaching hands. With a final desperate shove, the wall gave way. A narrow passage opened before us, the air beyond colder and darker than anything we'd felt yet. Without hesitation, we plunged into the unknown, the figure's glowing eyes burning behind us as the passage sealed shut. The passage was narrow, the walls pressing in so tightly I could feel the rough stone scraping against my arms as we stumbled forward. The air inside was colder than before, almost freezing, each breath condensing into faint clouds that hung in the dim light of our flashlights. The rasping sound of our breathing filled the space, mingling with the faint scrape of our shoes against the uneven floor. The walls were damp, the moisture clinging to them like sweat, and the faint metallic tang of rust hung heavy in the air. It was darker here, impossibly dark, as though the shadows were alive and devouring every ounce of light. My flashlight's beam seemed weaker, flickering as though struggling to keep its focus. Every step forward felt like a battle against an unseen force, the weight of the air pressing down on us with an oppressive, almost sentient malice. Ben was ahead of me, his movements sharp and deliberate. His hand skimmed the wall as though he were trying to find another door, another escape. Behind me, Mia stumbled, clutching her camera tightly to her chest, her breathing uneven and shallow. Alan was somewhere farther back, muttering under his breath, his words too soft to make out but laced with panic. The passage sloped downward, the incline slight but steady, pulling us deeper into the heart of whatever nightmare we'd stumbled into. My legs burned from the effort, my muscles trembling with the strain. I didn't know how long we'd been walking, but it felt like hours, each step dragging us further from the surface, from safety, from sanity. Then the whispers returned. They started faintly, just on the edge of hearing, like a distant breeze, carrying fragmented words. But they grew louder with each step, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They overlapped and twisted together, their meanings lost in the noise, but their intent clear, mocking, taunting, beckoning. "Do you hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't wait for an answer. "It's closer." I didn't respond. I couldn't. "You'll soon stay in Canadius." My throat was too tight, my chest too heavy. The whispers weren't just noise. They were inside me, threading themselves through my thoughts, unraveling my sense of self. Memories surfaced unbidden, moments from my past that didn't belong here. Faces I hadn't seen in years, mistakes I thought I'd buried, fears I thought I'd conquered. They swirled in my mind, blending with the whispers, until I couldn't tell where they ended and I began. The passage widened abruptly, opening into a chamber that was vast and eerily symmetrical. The floor was slick with a dark, viscous liquid that reflected the pale glow of our flashlights like oil. The walls were covered in markings, symbols carved deep into the stone, their edges sharp and jagged. They seemed to pulse faintly, their glow waxing and waning in time with the whispers. At the center of the chamber was a structure, a platform of sorts, made of the same dark stone as the walls, but smoother, polished to a sheen that felt unnatural in this place. On the platform rested a single object, a chair, rusted and decrepit, its metal frame twisted and jagged. Straps hung loosely from its arms and legs, their leather cracked and brittle with age. "What is this?" Ben muttered, his voice low and shaky. He stepped forward, his flashlight trained on the chair. "It looks like a restraint," Mia finished, her voice barely audible. "For patience." Alan laughed then, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed unnaturally in the chamber. "Patience," he said, his voice rising. Of course it's for patience. Why wouldn't it be? This whole place is a..." His words broke off into a sob, and he turned away, his shoulders shaking. Ben ignored him, his focus fixed on the chair. He moved closer, his steps cautious but deliberate. I wanted to call out to him, to tell him to stop, but the words caught in my throat. The whispers were louder now, a tide of sound that seemed to push against my skull, making it impossible to think. Ben reached the platform and hesitated, his flashlight beam illuminating the chair. For a moment, nothing happened. The chamber was still, the air heavy and suffocating. And then the light flickered. It wasn't just Ben's flashlight. All of our lights faltered at once, their beams dimming and stuttering, as though the darkness itself was fighting back. The whispers surged, their volume deafening now, their intent unmistakable. I felt it in my chest, in my bones. Something was waking up. The markings on the walls flared to life, their glow intensifying until the chamber was bathed in a pale, sickly light. The shadows twisted and writhed, pulling themselves free from the walls and pooling at the edges of the room. They moved with purpose, coalescing into shapes that were almost human, but not quite. Their forms were elongated, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Back!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Get back!" Ben stumbled away from the platform, his flashlight dropping to the ground with a clatter. The shadows surged forward, their forms solidifying as they moved. Their faces, or what passed for faces, were smooth and featureless, their heads tilting at unnatural angles as they closed in on us. Mia screamed, the sound piercing and raw, and bolted for the far side of the chamber. Alan followed, his muttering turning into a string of incoherent cries. Ben and I didn't move. "How tight?" We couldn't. The shadows were everywhere, their glowing eyes fixed on us, their movements too deliberate, too precise. The chair on the platform began to shake, its metal frame groaning as though something unseen was straining against it. The straps tightened of their own accord, pulling taut with a force that made the leather creak. The air around it shimmered, distorting like heat waves rising from pavement, and a low, guttural sound filled the chamber. We weren't alone anymore. The air in the chamber shifted, growing impossibly heavy, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. The guttural sound reverberated through the room, low and primal, shaking the walls and rattling the rusted chair at the center of the platform. The glowing symbols pulsed brighter with each passing second, their jagged lines burning into my vision like afteridges. The shadows had stopped moving, their featureless heads tilted toward the chair as though waiting for something to happen. Ben grabbed my arm, his grip so tight it sent a jolt of pain shooting up to my shoulder. "We have to go," he said, his voice low and desperate. His face was pale, his eyes darting between the shadows and the platform. "We can't stay here." I couldn't respond. My throat was too tight, my mind too overwhelmed by the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing. The chair wasn't just shaking anymore. It was moving, its rusted frame creaking and groaning as it shifted in place. The straps hung limply, swaying like they were caught in a breeze that didn't exist. And then they snapped taut, pulling against the metal as though something unseen was trying to escape. Mia's scream cut through the noise, sharp and raw. She was pressed against the far wall, her camera held tightly to her chest, her flashlight beam trembling as it danced across the room. "What is that?" she choked out, her voice barely audible over the rising sound. I didn't have an answer. I wasn't sure there was one. The guttural noise grew louder, almost like a voice, but distorted and inhuman, rising and falling in a cadence that felt deliberate, purposeful. The shadows began to move again, slowly, this time, their elongated limbs stretching as they slid across the floor toward the platform. The chair stopped moving. Eerie, Tadinin. For a moment, everything was still. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the symbols on the walls, their glow casting eerie, flickering shadows across the space. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. And then, with a sound like tearing metal, the chair collapsed inward, folding in on itself until it was nothing but a jagged mass of rusted steel. From within the twisted remains, something emerged. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its body was skeletal, its limbs impossibly long and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. The glow from the symbols seemed to cling to it, wrapping around its form like a second skin, illuminating every sharp angle and jagged edge. Its head was featureless, smooth and blank, but it turned toward us with a precision that sent a chill racing down my spine. The shadows surged forward, converging on the creature as though drawn to it, their forms twisting and merging until they became one with its body. The room darkened as they disappeared, the light from the symbols dimming until only the faintest glow remained, casting the creature in sharp relief. It moved toward us, then pulled me back, his grip unrelenting as he dragged me toward the far side of the chamber. "Move," he shouted, his voice breaking. "We have to move." Mia and Alan followed, their footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space. The creature's movements were slow, deliberate, each step sending a low, resonant sound, rippling through the air. The walls seemed to shudder with its approach, cracks spidering outward from the symbols, as though the very structure of the room was buckling under its presence. We reached the edge of the chamber, where the narrow passage we'd entered through waited. But the entrance was gone, sealed shut by a solid wall of stone that hadn't been there before. Ben pounded his fists against it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But it didn't budge. "We're trapped," Mia cried, her voice rising in panic. "What do we do?" I turned back toward the creature, my flashlight beam catching on its skeletal form. "Any viewers I blur, but it was closer now. Its movements faster, more purposeful. The guttural noise had returned, louder and more insistent, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. It wasn't just noise. It was a voice, speaking words I couldn't understand, but that filled me with a deep, primal terror. The symbols on the walls flared one last time, their light blinding, and then they went out entirely, plunging the chamber into darkness. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything but the pounding of my heart and the faint rasp of my own breath. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't loud, but it filled the space completely, resonating in my mind like it was coming from inside my own thoughts. The words were distorted, fragmented, but their meaning was clear. "You shouldn't have come." The light from our flashlights flickered weakly, barely illuminating the space around us. The creature was gone, its form swallowed by the darkness, but the sense of its presence remained, a heavy weight pressing down on me with every passing second. Ben turned toward me, his face barely visible in the dim light. "It's toying with us," he said, his voice shaking. "It could have killed us already, but it's waiting. It wants us to." He didn't finish. The wall behind him split open with a deafening crack, a jagged fissure spreading outward and spilling faint, flickering light into the chamber. Beyond the opening was another passage, wider this time, its walls lined with more of the glowing symbols. Mia grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "We have to go," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't stay here." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and followed Ben and Alan into the new passage. The air was colder here, the whispers louder, their words clearer, but no less terrifying. They weren't just voices anymore. They were memories, fragments of thoughts and fears that didn't belong to me, but felt intimately familiar. The passage sloped downward again, pulling us deeper into the unknown. The guttural noise had faded, but the sense of dread only grew stronger with each step. Wall. The walls seemed to close in around us, their glowing symbols pulsing faintly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, guided towards something waiting in the dark. The passage seemed endless, its walls pulsing faintly with that strange, unnatural light. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, as though the air around us was thickening, slowing us down. My flashlight's beam barely illuminated more than a few feet ahead, and the further we went, the more the light seemed to falter, bending and twisting as if it were being devoured by the darkness. Ben was ahead, his movements sharp and deliberate, though I could see the tension in his shoulders. Mia followed close behind me, her breathing ragged and uneven, her flashlight swinging wildly with each step. Alan trailed at the back, muttering under his breath, his voice a frantic, broken cadence that I couldn't make sense of, but that set my nerves on edge. The whispers were constant now, rising and falling like a tide, their voices threading through my thoughts, filling the cracks in my mind. They weren't just noise anymore. They were personal. They called my name, soft and mocking, weaving together fragments of my past in ways that made my chest tighten. Mistakes I'd buried, fears I thought I'd conquered. They all resurfaced here, clawing at the edges of my sanity. Ben stopped abruptly, and I nearly collided with him. His flashlight had caught on something up ahead, a faint shape just visible in the distance. It was a door, or what was left of one. The wood was splintered and rotting, the frame leaning awkwardly against the stone wall, as though it had been hastily thrown into place and forgotten. The symbols on the walls grew brighter around it, their jagged lines pulsing in time with the whispers. Suntigua, we have to go through, Ben said, his voice tight. He didn't look at us as he spoke, his focus fixed entirely on the door. He didn't wait for agreement, either. He moved forward, his steps quick and deliberate, his flashlight beam bouncing erratically against the walls. Mia grabbed my arm as we followed, her nails digging into my skin. "This doesn't feel right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "None of this feels right." I didn't answer. There was no point. Nothing about this had felt right since we'd stepped into the hospital, and it wasn't going to start now. Ben reached the door and hesitated, his hand hovering over the splintered wood. For a moment, he seemed frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, with a sudden jerking motion, he pushed it open. The room beyond was massive, its walls stretching upward into darkness, the ceiling lost in the shadows. The floor was uneven, a jagged expanse of stone covered in that same dark, viscous liquid that we'd seen before. At the center of the room stood an altar, or what looked like one. It was a slab of dark stone, its surface etched with more symbols, their glow casting faint, flickering light across the room. and on the altar something moved. It was subtle at first, just a faint ripple of motion, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a single drop. But as we stepped closer, the movement became more pronounced. Shadows twisted and writhed around the altar, their forms flickering and indistinct, as though they were caught between realities. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a single low hum that resonated in my chest. "What is this?" Mia's voice was barely more than a whisper, her words trembling as she clutched her camera tightly to her chest. Ben didn't answer. It didn't answer. He stepped closer to the altar, his flashlight beam catching on the shifting shadows. "Onu den mewend hagen belusias den ka doubt." For a moment, they seemed to recoil, retreating into the edges of the room. But then they surged forward, their movements sudden and violent. One of the shadows lashed out, a jagged tendril of darkness striking Ben's flashlight and sending it spinning to the ground. "Ben?" I shouted, my voice cracking as I lunged forward. The shadows writhed around him, their forms coiling and twisting, their edges razor sharp. He stumbled back, his hands clawing at the air, his face pale and stricken with terror. The altar pulsed, a wave of light rippling outward from its surface, and the shadows retreated, slithering back into the corners of the room. Ben fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his hands trembling as he pushed himself upright. His flashlight was shattered, its pieces scattered across the floor. "We're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice shaking. "It's guarding something." Before I could respond, the altar pulsed again, its light growing brighter, harsher. The shadows reemerged, their forms sharper now, more defined. They moved with purpose, converging on the center of the room, their movements synchronized and deliberate. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, their voices overlapping in a chaotic, maddening symphony. Then I saw it. The shadows weren't just guarding the altar. They were coming from it. They poured out from the cracks and crevices in the stone, their forms growing and solidifying as they moved. They weren't human, not anymore. Their limbs were too long, their movements too fluid, their faces featureless, save for the faint glow of their eyes. "We have to stop it," Ben said suddenly, his voice urgent. He grabbed the camera from Mia, his hands shaking as he aimed it at the altar. "We have to destroy it." "How?" I asked, my voice rising with panic. "What are we supposed to do?" Before Ben could answer, the shadows surged forward, their movements violent and chaotic. One of them lashed out at Mia, striking her camera and sending it crashing to the ground. She screamed, stumbling back, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and rolling into the darkness. The altar pulsed again, its light blinding, and I felt a sudden, searing pain in my chest. It wasn't physical. It was deeper, sharper, a tearing sensation that made my vision blur and my thoughts scatter. The whispers grew louder, their voices pressing against my skull, drowning out everything else. Ben shouted something, his words lost in the chaos, and lunged toward the altar. The shadows converged on him, their movements frenzied, but he didn't stop. He reached the altar, his hands slamming down on its surface, and the room erupted in light. Everything went white. The light was blinding, searing through my eyelids, even as I squeezed them shut. My body felt weightless for a moment, suspended in the overwhelming brightness that seemed to erase the edges of the world. The whispers, once deafening, fell silent, leaving behind a hollow, ringing emptiness that made my ears throb. When the light finally dimmed, I opened my eyes slowly, the room around me coming back into focus. The altar was still there, but it was different now. The symbols carved into its surface no longer glowed. Instead, they seemed to smolder faintly, like embers struggling to reignite. The shadows were gone, their absence leaving the space eerily still. But the oppressive weight of the air hadn't lifted. If anything, it felt heavier, thicker, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Ben was on the floor near the altar, his body crumpled and still. My heart lurched as I stumbled toward him, my knees nearly buckling beneath me. Ben! I called, my voice raw and desperate. He didn't respond. His flashlight lay shattered nearby, its broken pieces glinting weakly in the dim light. I reached his side and dropped to my knees, my hands trembling as I shook his shoulder. His skin was cold, clammy, but he was breathing, shallow, uneven breaths that sounded more like gasps. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, they didn't seem to focus, staring past me at something I couldn't see. "It's not over," he whispered, his voice so faint I had to lean in to hear him. "It's still here." Before I could ask what he meant, a deep, resonant sound filled the chamber. It wasn't a whisper. Not this time. It was a single low note, like the tolling of a massive bell, vibrating through the floor and into my bones. The altar began to pulse again, faintly at first, but with increasing intensity, the smoldering symbols on its surface reigniting one by one. Mia was crouched near the far wall, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her camera was gone, lost in the chaos, and she looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "What did he do?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What did he do to it?" I didn't have an answer. I wasn't even sure what Ben had done. He'd reached for the altar, touched it, and now everything felt wrong, more wrong than it had before. The tolling sound grew louder, each note reverberating through the chamber like a physical force. The air seemed to shimmer, distorting the edges of the room, bending the light into strange, twisting patterns. The floor beneath the altar cracked, thin fissures spreading outward, glowing faintly with the same pale light that had filled the chamber before. Ben stirred, his body twitching as though he were trying to sit up. His eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw fear there. Not the kind of fear we'd been feeling all night, but something deeper something primal. It's waking up, he said, his voice hoarse. We have to stop it. We have to destroy it. How? I asked, my voice breaking. What are we supposed to do? The fissures widened, the glow intensifying, and from within the cracks came a sound, a deep, guttural noise that sent a shiver racing down my spine. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, something vast and ancient, something that didn't belong in our world. The altar began to shake, pieces of stone breaking away and falling to the floor, as though the thing inside was trying to break free. Mia let out a strangled cry, her hands clawing at the wall as though she could tear her way out of the room. We're going to die here, she sobbed, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. We're going to die. Not yet, Ben said, his voice stronger now. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying unsteadily as he turned toward the altar. Not if we stop it. I didn't understand what he was planning to do, but there was no time to argue. The cracks in the floor spread further, the light within them blinding now, and the guttural noise grew louder, filling the chamber with a sound that felt like it was tearing the air apart. The altar splintered, a massive chunk of stone falling away to reveal something inside, something dark and pulsating, like a heart made of shadow and light. Ben turned to me, his expression grim. Keep it distracted, he said, his words clipped and urgent. I'll destroy it, distract it, I repeated, my voice incredulous. Ah, so what did he should use? How do you distract that? But he didn't answer. He moved toward the altar, his movements slow and deliberate, his hands clenched into fists. The pulsating heart seemed to notice him. Or maybe it felt him. The light around it flared brighter, the guttural noise rising to a deafening pitch as tendrils of shadow burst from the cracks, lashing out at Ben with terrifying speed. I didn't think. I just moved. I grabbed a chunk of broken stone from the floor and hurled it at the heart, the impact sending a faint ripple through the light surrounding it. The tendrils hesitated, shifting their focus toward me, and I felt a surge of cold, searing pain as one of them lashed across my arm, leaving a jagged, burning mark in its wake. Ben reached the altar, his hands pressing against the jagged edges of the stone. The light around the heart pulsed violently, the tendrils flailing wildly, as though trying to shake him off. He shouted something, a word, a phrase. I couldn't make it out over the noise, and then there was another flash of light, even brighter than before. The tendrils recoiled, retreating into the cracks, and the heart began to flicker, its light dimming, its pulsations slowing. Ben staggered back, his face pale, his hands slick with something dark and oily. The guttural noise faded, replaced by a low, shuddering hum, and the cracks in the floor began to close, the light within them extinguishing one by one. For a moment, everything was still. The chamber was silent, the altar reduced to a pile of rubble, and the oppressive weight in the air seemed to lift, just slightly. I sank to the floor, my chest heaving, my arm throbbing with pain. Mia crawled toward me, her face streaked with tears, her hands shaking as she reached for mine. Ben stood at the edge of the altar, his shoulders slumped, his breathing shallow. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and then his legs gave out, and he collapsed to the ground. Ben's body hit the ground with a sickening thud, his weight sending a faint echo through the now eerily still chamber. My legs screamed at me to move, but my body felt frozen, pinned in place by the crushing silence that had settled over everything. The altar, once the source of so much chaos and light, was now nothing more than a crumbled heap of jagged stone. The pulsating heart that had throbbed within it was gone, replaced by a faint, lingering hum that vibrated in my chest like a phantom heartbeat. I forced myself to my feet, my knees shaking beneath me, and stumbled toward Ben. Mia crawled alongside me, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts as tears streaked her pale, dirt-smeared face. Ben's eyes were closed, his skin a sickly gray, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven gasps. "Ben," I whispered, my voice cracking as I reached out to touch his shoulder. His body was cold, unnaturally so, and he didn't respond. His lips moved faintly, forming words I couldn't hear, couldn't understand. Mia leaned closer, her hands trembling as she grabbed his arm. "He's still alive," she said, her voice a mix of hope and despair. "He's still. And he's ill." The ground beneath us shuddered, a low, ominous rumble that sent a cascade of pebbles and dust falling from the cracked walls. The air in the chamber shifted again, growing heavier, colder, and the faint hum deepened, becoming a low, resonant vibration that seemed to echo from somewhere far below. "It's not over," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. The words felt like an admission, a final horrible truth that settled over me like a weight I couldn't shake. Destroying the altar hadn't ended it. Whatever we'd disturbed was still here, still alive, still watching. Mia's flashlight flickered, the weak beam sputtering as though the darkness was swallowing it whole. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We can't stay here. We have to." Before she could finish, the rumbling intensified, the floor beneath us splitting open in a jagged crack that radiated outward from the remnants of the altar. A brilliant, blinding light erupted from the fissure. Not the pale, sickly glow from before, but something sharper, more vivid, like the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. The hum turned into a roar, deafening and relentless, drowning out everything else. I grabbed Mia's arm and pulled her back as the crack widened, swallowing the rubble of the altar and spreading toward the walls. Ben's body slipped toward the edge, and I lunged for him, my fingers barely catching the collar of his shirt as I yanked him away from the growing chasm. His body was limp, heavy, and I struggled to drag him across the shaking floor. "We have to move," I shouted, the words barely audible over the roar. The chamber was collapsing around us, the walls buckling inward as chunks of stone fell from above, crashing to the ground with thunderous force. Mia helped me lift Ben, her movements frantic and uncoordinated, and together We stumbled toward the passage we had come through, but the way was blocked. Now, the entrance sealed by a massive slab of stone that had fallen from the ceiling. The only path left was the one the light had created, the crack in the floor spreading like a jagged wound that beckoned us forward. "It's the only way out," Mia said, her voice desperate. "We don't have a choice." I hesitated, staring into the crack as the light pulsed and flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. It felt alive, sentient, as though it were watching us, waiting for us to make a decision. But she was right. There was nowhere else to go. Clutching Ben's arm tightly, we stepped into the fissure, the light swallowing us whole. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, a jarring, disorienting pull that seemed to tear the edges of my mind. The world around us blurred and twisted, the floor vanishing beneath my feet as we fell. Not downward, but through something, an infinite expanse of light and shadow that bent and stretched in ways that defied logic. When the ground returned, it was sudden and jarring, the impact sending a shockwave of pain through my body. I gasped, the air around me sharp and cold, and looked up to find myself in a place that was both familiar and impossibly alien. We were back in the hospital, or what was left of it. The walls were crumbling, the ceiling gone, replaced by a swirling void of light and darkness that stretched endlessly above us. The symbols that had adorned the walls before were here too, but they no longer glowed. Instead, they flickered faintly, their jagged lines broken and fragmented like shattered glass. Ben groaned beside me, his eyes fluttering open as he struggled to sit up. His movements were sluggish, his face pale and drawn. But he was alive. Barely. Mia clutched her flashlight, though its beam was weak and faltering, barely cutting through the gloom. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is this place?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't know. Empty glow that I didn't know. It felt like the hospital, but it wasn't. It was something else entirely, something in between. A liminal space that defied explanation. A fragment of a reality we weren't meant to see. The rumbling returned, faint but growing, and the light above us began to shift, twisting and pulsing like a living thing. The air grew colder, heavier, and I realized with a sinking dread that we weren't alone. From the shadows, figures began to emerge, their forms twisted and indistinct, their movements jerky and unnatural. They had no faces, no features, just hollow, empty shapes that radiated malice. They moved toward us, slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the inevitability of our doom. Ben struggled to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him, and grabbed my arm. "We have to end this," he said, his voice low and firm. "We can't leave it like this." "How?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "What can we possibly do?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the void above us, his gaze fixed on the swirling light. "It's still there," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "The heart, it's still alive." Before I could stop him, he stepped forward, his body trembling, but his resolve unwavering. The figures moved closer, their hollow forms converging on him. But he didn't falter. He reached into his jacket, pulling something out. A shard of the broken altar, its edges jagged and gleaming, flickering light. "No," Mia screamed, her voice breaking as she lunged toward him. But it was too late. Ben raised the shard high above his head, his eyes meeting mine for one final fleeting moment, and then he drove it into the ground, into the very heart of the light. The world erupted in a blinding flash, the roar of the void consuming everything. The air at the entrance to Black Hollow Mine was unnaturally still, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, making your heartbeat feel louder than it should. The faded wooden sign, tilted at an awkward angle, read "Keep Out" in faded red paint, and the chains draped over the rusted gates seemed more ceremonial than functional. The wind, if there even was any, failed to stir the loose dirt beneath our feet. Everything about this place felt wrong, as though the very ground had absorbed years of fear and sorrow, locking it into the soil. We stepped through the broken gate one by one, our flashlights cutting through the early evening gloom. The path leading to the main entrance of the mine was narrow, hemmed in by jagged rocks and overgrown brush. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows cast by our lights moved just a little too slowly, lingering a beat too long before fading back into the darkness. My grip on the flashlight tightened as the others trudged ahead, their nervous chatter fading into the background. The entrance to the mine yawned open before us, a black void framed by warped timbers and crumbling stone. A faint metallic tang hung in the air, sharp and acrid, reminding me of blood left to dry. It was colder here, the kind of cold that sank deep into your skin and stayed there, no matter how tightly you pulled your jacket around you. The others hesitated for a moment, their lights flickering across the jagged opening, and then Rachel took the first step inside. The mine swallowed her light almost immediately, the beam barely penetrating the dense shadows. One by one, we followed, the sound of our footsteps crunching against the gravel floor, echoing eerily in the confined space. The walls closed in around us, the air thick and stale, carrying a faint, earthy scent that made my throat tighten. My flashlight's beam revealed old wooden supports, splintered and leaning, their once sturdy frames now warped and rotted. Scribbled markings adorned the walls, crude symbols etched into the stone that looked almost like warnings. We pressed further into the mine, our voices hushed, every sound amplified by the oppressive stillness. The deeper we went, the more the sense of unease grew. It was as though the mine itself was alive, watching, waiting. My chest felt tight, the air too thin, too cold. It was Rachel who noticed it first. A faint sound, just on the edge of hearing, a low rhythmic tapping, like the echo of distant footsteps. "Did anyone hear that?" she whispered, her flashlight beam darting nervously along the walls. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We all heard it. The tapping grew louder as we ventured deeper, its rhythm steady and deliberate, like a heartbeat. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell how close it was. The light from our flashlights seemed weaker now, as though the shadows were pushing back against it, consuming the brightness. My breath fogged in the icy air, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my pulse quickening. We reached a fork in the tunnel, the path splitting into two equally dark and uninviting directions. Rachel hesitated, her light flickering as she aimed it down the left tunnel. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that felt even worse. She turned back toward us, her face pale in the dim light, and then we heard it, a voice, faint and distant, echoing from somewhere deep within the mine. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, soft, lilting, almost melodic. It sounded like a woman, her words impossible to make out, but carrying a tone that sent a chill racing down my spine. Rachel's head snapped toward the sound, her light shaking as it cut through the darkness. Without a word, she moved toward it. "Wait," I called out, my voice harsh against the silence. But she didn't stop. Her steps quickened, the beam of her flashlight bouncing wildly as she disappeared down the left tunnel. The rest of us hesitated, fear rooting us in place, the weight of the mine pressing down on us like a vice. The voice came again, softer now, but closer, pulling at us like a tide. We didn't have a choice. We didn't have a choice. We followed her. The tunnel narrowed as we moved deeper, the air growing colder, thinner. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as though it were struggling against something unseen. The walls seemed to close in, the symbols etched into the stone, becoming more elaborate, more frantic, their sharp lines cutting into the rock like wounds. The voice grew louder, echoing through the tunnel, and with it came a faint, metallic scraping sound, like nails dragging across stone. I rounded a corner and stopped cold. Rachel's flashlight lay on the ground, its beam flickering weakly, casting long, jagged shadows across the tunnel walls. She was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the darkness, the others catching up behind me, their breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The voice was gone now, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed against my ears, making the blood rush in my head. I moved toward her flashlight, picking it up with trembling hands, and felt a surge of cold air rush past me, carrying with it a faint, hollow whisper. It said my name. Phew. The tunnel around us groaned, the sound deep and resonant, as though the mine itself were shifting. The walls trembled, dust raining down from above. and the faint tapping sound returned, louder this time, closer. It wasn't footsteps. It was something else, something alive. We turned and ran, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we stumbled back the way we'd come. The tapping followed, steady and relentless, growing louder with every step. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly now, their jagged lines pulsing like veins, casting eerie patterns across the stone. The air grew colder, sharper, slicing through my lungs with each ragged breath. The tunnel split again, the fork we'd passed earlier now unfamiliar, its paths warped and twisted. We stopped, panic surging through us as we realized we didn't know which way to go. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a low guttural sound that vibrated through the floor beneath us. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. The figure in the darkness was barely human. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though it were testing the limits of its form. My flashlight's beam caught on its face, or what should have been a face. Instead, there was only smooth, pale skin stretched tightly over a misshapen skull, with no eyes, no nose, just the faint suggestion of features that seemed to shift and blur as it moved. The tapping resumed, sharper now, echoing in time with its slow, uneven steps. My heart hammered against my ribs, my breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a scream. I stumbled backward, the beam of my flashlight trembling as it danced over the figure. Its head tilted toward me, jerking slightly, and for a moment I swore it was listening, attuned to the sound of my fear. Then it moved faster. The thing lunged, its body twisting unnaturally as it surged toward us. I barely had time to shout before the others screamed and scattered. Mia bolted down one of the tunnels, her flashlight swinging wildly, the beam catching glimpses of jagged rock and symbols glowing faintly in the darkness. Ben grabbed my arm and yanked me in the opposite direction, his grip bruising as he dragged me down a narrower passage. Alan's shouts echoed behind us, but they grew fainter, swallowed by the oppressive weight of the mine. The tunnel closed in around us, the walls pressing tighter with each step. My lungs burned, the air growing thinner, colder, each breath a struggle. Ben's flashlight flickered, its beam sputtering as though fighting against the darkness. And I realized with dawning horror that the tapping hadn't stopped. It was following us, steady and relentless, growing louder as the tunnel twisted and turned. Ben? Ben! I gasped, my voice raw. Where are we going? He didn't answer. His face was pale, his eyes wide and wild. And he didn't look back. He just kept moving, pulling me forward, his breaths coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The ground beneath us shifted, loose gravel crunching underfoot, and I stumbled, nearly falling before he caught me and pulled me upright. The tunnel opened suddenly into a larger chamber, the air colder and heavier than before. The space was vast, the ceiling lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with jagged veins of coal that seemed to glimmer faintly in the dim light. Rusted mining equipment was scattered across the floor. Old carts overturned, tools broken and discarded, their metal edges warped with age. In the center of the chamber was a massive wooden structure, its beams splintered and sagging, holding up a series of rusted chains that dangled limply, their ends disappearing into the darkness above. Ben stopped abruptly, his flashlight beam sweeping over the room. His grip on my arm loosened, and I stumbled forward, catching myself on the rough stone wall. My breathing was loud in my ears, drowning out everything but the steady pounding of my heart. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse, heavier, pressing against my skull like a vice. The air was thick, suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, lurking just beyond the reach of our lights. Ben turned slowly, his flashlight sweeping across the chamber, and I saw the faint tremble in his hands. Then we heard it, not tapping this time, but a voice, soft, lilting, and impossibly close. "Why did you come?" The words echoed through the chamber, distorted and wrong, each syllable stretching unnaturally, as though spoken by something that didn't quite understand the mechanics of speech. My stomach turned, my skin prickling with cold sweat. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting wildly. But there was nothing there, just shadows, shifting and writhing at the edges of the light. "Ben," I whispered, my voice trembling, "we have to get out of here." He nodded, his movements stiff, and we turned toward the tunnel we'd come through, but the way was gone. The entrance had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of stone, smooth and unbroken. My chest tightened, panic clawing at the edges of my mind as I stumbled forward, my hands pressing against the cold, unyielding surface. "No, no, no," I muttered, my voice breaking. "This can't be happening." Behind us, the voice came again, closer now, its tone sharper, more insistent. "Why did you come?" Ben spun around, his flashlight beam catching on something that hadn't been there before. A figure stood at the edge of the chamber, its form flickering and indistinct like a shadow cast by a flame. "When I lay in cold style," its head tilted slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized it wasn't standing on the ground. It was hovering, its feet inches above the stone floor. The tapping resumed, louder now, each impact reverberating through the chamber like the toll of a distant bell. The figure moved forward, its body twisting and contorting with each step, its shadow stretching impossibly long across the floor. Ben grabbed my arm again, his grip like iron, and yanked me toward the center of the room. "This way," he said, his voice barely audible over the tapping. "There has to be another way out." We stumbled toward the wooden structure, the chains rattling faintly as we approached. My flashlight caught on something carved into one of the beams, symbols, crude and jagged, similar to the ones we'd seen in the tunnels. But these were different. They glowed faintly, their edges sharp and deliberate, and I could feel the weight of them pressing against my mind, filling my thoughts with a low, droning hum. The tapping grew louder, closer, the sound pounding in my ears, and I realized, with dawning horror, that it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from above. Hey! I looked up, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and froze. The chains weren't empty. Something hung from them, its form obscured by shadow, its edges indistinct. It writhed slowly, its movements deliberate, as though testing the strength of its bonds. The tapping came from its limbs, clawed hands striking against the metal as it twisted and turned. And then it stopped. The figure below moved faster now, its body blurring as it surged toward us. Ben shouted something, his voice lost in the chaos, and grabbed one of the rusted tools from the floor, swinging it wildly as the figure closed the distance. The chains above rattled violently, the sound deafening, and I felt the floor beneath us tremble as the walls of the chamber began to close in. The chains rattled like the hollow echo of 100 metallic screams, each one reverberating through the chamber and vibrating deep in my chest. My flashlight beam caught on the suspended figure above us, swaying slightly as it twisted against its restraints. The thing's shape was indistinct, a smudged outline of limbs and shadow that seemed to shift with each movement. But its face, or where its face should have been, was sharp and clear. Two hollow voids stared down at us, eyes that weren't eyes, dark and endless and burning with something that felt alive. Ben swung the rusted tool again, his movements frantic, wild. The figure below darted to the side, its motions inhumanly fast, as though the very concept of speed didn't apply to it the same way it did to us. Its body flickered in and out of focus like a poorly tuned broadcast, and every time I tried to pin it down with my gaze, my stomach churned. "Keep moving," Ben shouted, his voice ragged as he lunged toward me, grabbing my arm and dragging me back. The suspended figure above let out a sound, not a scream, but something deeper, a rumbling growl that seemed to stretch the air around us, bending it until I felt like my ears might burst. We stumbled back toward the edge of the chamber, our flashlights bobbing wildly, their beams cutting through the thick, suffocating darkness that seemed to push against us from all sides. The walls, slick with some kind of dark, oily residue, seemed to pulse faintly, as though the mine itself was alive, reacting to our presence. Behind me, the tapping resumed. It was louder now, each impact like the crack of a hammer against steel, steady and deliberate, closer with every step. My mind raced, the edges of my thoughts unraveling, as the sound wormed its way deeper into my head, eroding any sense of reason. It wasn't just a noise, it was a message, a demand, a summons. Mia's scream pierced through the chaos, snapping me back into focus. I turned just in time to see her stumble backward, her flashlight spinning out of her hands and clattering to the ground. She was staring at something in the darkness, her face pale, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. I followed her gaze, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, and froze. The figure had multiplied. There were three now, their forms identical, their movements synchronized as they stepped closer. Their faces were the same smooth voids, their hollow eyes fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They moved as one, each step perfectly matched, their bodies flickering in and out of existence with each motion. "We're trapped," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't move, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as though she might disappear into her own body if she just held on tightly enough. "No," Ben said, his voice harsh and desperate. "There's a way out. There has to be." His flashlight beam swept across the chamber, illuminating the wooden structure in the center. The chains rattled again, the sound impossibly loud, and I felt the ground beneath us tremble as the thing above us shifted, its limbs twitching as though testing its restraints. "The lift?" Ben said suddenly, his flashlight settling on a rusted lever bolted to the side of the structure. "It's a lift. It has to go somewhere." I hesitated, my gaze flicking between the lever and the figures closing in on us. The tapping was deafening now, each impact reverberating through the chamber, and the suspended figure let out another low, rumbling growl that made my teeth ache. Ben didn't wait for an answer. He dropped the tool and lunged toward the lever, his movements quick and desperate. The figures surged forward, their bodies blurring as they closed the distance. But I didn't think. I just moved. I grabbed the nearest object, a jagged piece of broken chain, and swung it wildly, the metal whistling through the air as I tried to keep them at bay. Mia scrambled toward the lift, her movements frantic, and began fumbling with the rusted mechanism. Her hand slipped on the lever, her breath hitching as she yanked at it. But the machinery groaned in protest, the gears grinding loudly as though resisting her efforts. "Hurry!" I shouted, my voice cracking as I swung the chain again. One of the figures darted to the side, its movements too fast, too smooth, and I felt a sharp, icy pain slice across my arm as it lashed out with something I couldn't see. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the ground. The lift groaned to life, the platform shuddering as it began to rise, and Ben grabbed my arm, pulling me toward it. The figures were closer now, their hollow eyes burning into me, their movements deliberate and unrelenting. I felt their presence pressing against me, suffocating, as though the very act of being near them was tearing me apart. The platform jolted upward, the chains rattling violently as it ascended, and for a moment I thought we might make it. But then the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was heavy, oppressive, and it carried with it a terrible certainty. The suspended figure above twisted violently, the chains holding it snapping one by one with deafening cracks. The growl it let out wasn't just a sound. It was a force, a wave of energy that rippled through the chamber, shaking the walls and sending chunks of stone raining down around us. The platform jolted again, the chains pulling it upward faster now, and I grabbed the edge, my fingers digging into the rusted metal as I pulled myself up. Mia was huddled in the corner, her eyes wide and unblinking, and Ben was at the lever, his face pale, his jaw tight. The figure above broke free. It fell with a deafening crash, its body twisting as it landed on the chamber floor. And for the first time, I saw it clearly. It wasn't human. It never had been. It never had been. Its form was massive, its limbs too long, its body writhing with shadows that seemed to twist and coil like smoke. Its eyes, or what passed for eyes, were two burning voids staring up at us with a hatred so intense it felt like a physical weight. The platform lurched upward again, the chains straining, and the thing let out a roar that shook the walls, the sound so loud it drowned out everything else. The figures below watched silently as we ascended, their hollow eyes fixed on us. And I realized, with a sinking dread, that this wasn't over. We weren't escaping. We were being let go. The lift groaned beneath us, its chains rattling violently as it dragged us upward through the suffocating darkness. The air grew thinner with each jolt, the cold cutting deeper into my skin, clawing at my lungs. My hands clung to the rusted railing, the metal biting into my palms as the platform swayed precariously. Ben was at the lever, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly, his eyes darting toward the edges of the lift, where the darkness pressed in like a living thing. The roar from below still echoed in my ears, though it was distant now, muffled by the weight of the rock and soil between us and whatever horror we'd left behind. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was charged, electric, vibrating with a tension that I couldn't shake. Mia sat huddled in the corner, her knees drawn to her chest, her flashlight clutched tightly in her trembling hands. She hadn't spoken since we'd stepped onto the lift. I wasn't sure she could. The platform shuddered violently, and I stumbled, my grip slipping. Ben reached out, steadying me before I fell, his face pale and drawn. "We're almost there," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. His eyes betrayed him. They kept flicking toward the darkness below, as though expecting something to reach out and drag us back down. The walls around us were marked with the same strange symbols we'd seen in the tunnels. Sharp, angular carvings that seemed to pulse faintly in the weak light of our flashlights. They reminded me of veins, twisting and branching, alive with an energy that I couldn't explain but could feel in my chest, heavy and suffocating. The platform jolted again, and I heard a faint noise above us, a groaning creak that set my teeth on edge. I tilted my head back, squinting into the gloom, and caught the faintest glimpse of movement. The lift wasn't heading for freedom, Bunny. It was heading for another level, another chamber, and whatever waited for us, there was moving. The chains above groaned louder, and the lift shuddered to a halt, suspended in the air like a marionette on strings. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hiss of the chains swaying in the dark. Ben's hand hovered over the lever, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Then the platform dropped. It wasn't far, just a jarring lurch that made my stomach flip, but it was enough to send panic surging through me. I clung to the railing, my heart pounding as the lift stabilized, the chains groaning under its weight. A sound rose from below, faint but distinct. The tapping, steady and relentless, growing louder with each beat. My chest tightened, the memory of the figures flickering in my mind like a broken reel of film. The lift's movement resumed, slower this time, as though it were dragging us towards something that didn't want to be disturbed. My flashlight beam swept across the walls, catching on faint cracks that oozed a dark, viscous substance. The smell hit me a moment later, sharp, metallic, with an undercurrent of decay that made my stomach churn. "We're not going up," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question. The angle of the platform was clear now, tilting slightly downward, pulling us deeper into the earth. Ben didn't respond. His jaw was clenched, his eyes fixed ahead as the lift slid into a massive cavern. The ceiling stretched high above us, jagged and uneven, and the walls were lined with more of the glowing symbols, their faint light casting eerie shadows that twisted and writhed. The air was colder here, heavier, each breath feeling like it was being stolen from my lungs. The platform creaked to a stop at the edge of a stone ledge, the darkness beyond it vast and impenetrable. The tapping was louder now, reverberating through the cavern, and the faint glow of the symbols began to pulse, their light brightening and dimming in time with the sound. Mia let out a soft whimper, her fingers tightening around her flashlight as she huddled closer to the center of the lift. Ben stepped off first, his boots crunching against the gravel-strewn floor. I hesitated, my legs trembling as I forced myself to follow. The ground felt wrong beneath my feet, uneven, almost soft, as though it might give way at any moment. My flashlight beam swept across the cavern, catching on jagged stalactites that dripped with the same viscous liquid I'd seen in the cracks. The smell was stronger here, almost unbearable. At the center of the cavern stood an altar. Shiyu and third. It was massive, carved from the same dark stone as the walls, its surface etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. The air around it was heavy, charged, vibrating with an energy that made my skin crawl. Chains dangled from the ceiling above it, rusted and broken, their ends disappearing into the shadows. And then I saw it. The heart of the cavern. Suspended above the altar was a sphere, its surface smooth and black, gleaming faintly in the flickering light. It wasn't stone. No, it wasn't metal. It was something else entirely. Something alive. It pulsed faintly, in time with the tapping, and I felt its presence like a weight in my chest, pressing against my lungs, my ribs, my thoughts. Mia's flashlight flickered, and she let out a soft cry, her hands trembling as she aimed it toward the altar. The sphere pulsed brighter, and the tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver racing down my spine. It wasn't just a noise, it was a voice, deep and resonant, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but that filled me with a terror I couldn't explain. Ben moved closer to the altar, his steps slow and deliberate, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "This is it," he said, his voice barely audible. "This is what they were trying to hide." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "This is what they were trying to contain." The ground beneath us trembled, the symbols on the altar flaring brighter as the guttural voice rose, louder and more insistent. The chains above rattled violently, and I realized with dawning horror that the thing we'd left behind in the lower chamber wasn't the threat. This was. The sphere pulsed again, and the cavern erupted in light. The light erupted from the sphere in waves, blinding and unnatural, pulsing like the rhythm of an enormous, alien heartbeat. My vision blurred, streaks of white and black flickering across my eyes as I stumbled backward, my body instinctively recoiling from the searing brilliance. The guttural voice rose in volume, no longer just a sound, but a physical presence that pressed against my chest, forcing the air from my lungs. I dropped to my knees, gripping the uneven floor, as the ground trembled beneath me. The symbols carved into the walls glowed brighter, their jagged lines writhing like living veins, twisting and stretching toward the altar. The cavern seemed alive now, its very structure pulsing in time with the sphere's light, as though it were breathing, responding to the energy radiating from the object at its center. Ben was still moving forward, his flashlight aimed at the altar, though the beam seemed feeble against the intense glow. His steps were slow, but deliberate, his face pale and determined. "We have to stop it," he said, his voice barely audible over the rumbling that filled the cavern. "Whatever this is, it's waking up." Mia let out a strangled cry behind me, her flashlight clattering to the ground as she fell to her knees. Her hands clutched at her head, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "It's in my head," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can hear it. It's speaking." I crawled toward her, my own body shaking as the weight of the sphere's presence bore down on me. The closer I got, the more I could feel it too. Not words exactly, but impressions, emotions, fragments of thoughts that weren't my own. It was like something was pressing against the edges of my mind, peeling back the layers of who I was, exposing my fears, my regrets, my deepest, most hidden truths. Ben reached the altar and hesitated, his hand hovering over its surface. The sphere pulsed again, its light dimming slightly, and for a brief moment, the rumbling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very air from the room. Ben looked back at us, his eyes wide and desperate. "This isn't just a relic," he said, his voice cracking. "It's alive." Before I could respond, the sphere pulsed again, brighter this time, and the guttural voice returned, louder and more insistent. The chains above rattled violently, their rusted links creaking and groaning as they swayed in the intense energy radiating from the altar. A low, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through my bones, and the walls of the cavern began to crack, thin fissures spreading outward like spiderweb. Mia screamed, her hands clawing at her head, as though trying to rip the voice from her mind. "Make it stop," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "Please, make it stop." Ben's hand moved closer to the sphere, his fingers trembling as they hovered just above its surface. "If we destroy it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "maybe we can stop this." "No," I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Andy, we don't know what it'll do. What if it makes things worse?" His eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw the conflict there. The fear and uncertainty that mirrored my own. But then the ground beneath us shifted violently, and a decision was made for him. A massive crack split the floor of the cavern, the sound like a thunderclap as the stone beneath the altar fractured and fell away, revealing an abyss that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. The sphere wobbled, its glow flickering, and the guttural voice grew louder, angrier. Something moved in the darkness below. I couldn't see it, not clearly, but I could feel it. An enormous presence, vast and ancient, rising from the depths. The air grew colder, the light from the sphere dimming as the shadows around us stretched and deepened, swallowing the edges of the cavern. The chains above snapped one by one, their broken links falling into the abyss with faint, metallic clangs. Ben didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, his hands gripping the sphere. And for a moment, the light flared so brightly that it burned into my vision. The voice screamed, a sound so loud and piercing that it felt like it was tearing my mind apart. The cavern shook violently, chunks of stone falling from the ceiling, and I heard Mia's voice, faint and terrified, calling out my name. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. The cavern was plunged into darkness. The only sound, the faint crackle of stone settling into place. My flashlight flickered weakly from where it had fallen, casting a dim, uneven glow across the shattered altar. Ben was lying on the ground near the edge of the abyss, his body motionless, his hands still clutching the sphere, which was now dull and lifeless. I scrambled toward him, my heart pounding as I reached for his shoulder. "Ben!" I shouted, shaking him. "Ah, Ben! Wake up!" His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment they didn't focus, staring blankly past me. Then he gasped, his body jerking as though pulled from some terrible dream. "It's gone," he said, his voice weak, his chest heaving. I think I stopped it. Before I could respond, the ground beneath us groaned again, and I realized with a sinking dread that the cavern was still collapsing. The fissures in the walls were spreading, chunks of stone breaking away and tumbling into the abyss. The air was thick with dust and debris, the sound of crumbling rock, drowning out everything else. "Get up," I shouted, grabbing Ben's arm and pulling him to his feet. Mia was already moving, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she stumbled toward the far side of the cavern, where a narrow tunnel offered the faintest hope of escape. I followed, dragging Ben with me as the floor beneath us shifted and cracked, the abyss spreading closer with each step. We reached the tunnel just as the altar gave way, the stone collapsing into the void below, taking the sphere and whatever had been rising from the depths with it. The guttural voice faded, replaced by a deafening roar as the cavern imploded. The walls crumbling inward, sealing off whatever terror we had unleashed. The tunnel was narrow and winding, the air thick with dust and the faint metallic tang of blood. My legs burned, my lungs screaming for air as we ran. The sound of the collapsing cavern fading behind us. I didn't know where the tunnel led, or if it led anywhere at all. I only knew that we had to keep moving. The tunnel seemed endless, a twisting, suffocating path carved deep into the earth. The air grew colder with every step, sharp and thin, each breath a struggle. My flashlight's beam flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows that danced along the damp, cracked walls. Behind us, the distant rumble of the collapsing cavern echoed like a dying heartbeat, a reminder of how close we had come to being buried alive. Ben leaned heavily on me, his steps unsteady, his breaths shallow. He hadn't spoken since we'd pulled him away from the altar, and his face was pale, his eyes distant, unfocused. Whatever he'd done to the sphere had taken something from him, left him hollowed out in a way that made my chest tighten with unease. I didn't ask if he was okay. I already knew the answer. Mia was ahead of us, her flashlight swaying in her trembling hand as she moved deeper into the tunnel. Her pace was erratic, her movements frantic, as though she was being chased by something only she could see. I couldn't blame her. The mine felt alive now, the walls pulsing faintly with an energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It was as if the destruction of the sphere hadn't stopped whatever was down here. It had only made it angry. A sharp sound broke the silence, a crackling noise that echoed through the tunnel and set my nerves on edge. I froze, my flashlight beam darting toward the source. The walls around us were shifting, faint cracks spreading like spiderwebs, glowing faintly with the same sickly light that had radiated from the altar. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized with a sinking dread that it wasn't the walls. It was the tapping. The steady, relentless rhythm reverberated through the tunnel, each impact growing louder, closer. My chest tightened, my heart hammering as the sound pressed against my skull, worming its way into my thoughts. It wasn't just a noise. It was a summons, a command, an inevitability. Mia turned back to us, her eyes wide and frantic. "It's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's coming." I didn't need to ask what she meant. The tapping wasn't just sound anymore. It was presence, a weight that filled the air, thick and oppressive. I tightened my grip on Ben, dragging him forward as the noise grew louder. Each step feeling slower, heavier, as though the mine itself was fighting to keep us there. The tunnel opened suddenly into another chamber, smaller than the last, but just as suffocating. The walls were lined with jagged stones, their surfaces slick with the same dark, viscous liquid that had oozed from the cracks above. The air was frigid, biting into my skin, and the floor beneath us was uneven, littered with debris. that made every step treacherous. Mia stumbled toward the center of the chamber, her flashlight swinging wildly. "There's no way out," she said, her voice rising in panic. She turned in circles, her breathing shallow, her hands clutching her hair as though she might tear it out. "We're trapped. We're trapped." "Keep moving," I said, though my voice was hoarse, the words barely audible over the relentless tapping that echoed through the chamber. I didn't believe them, not really. But stopping wasn't an option. If we stopped, it would find us. Ben stirred beside me, his grip on my arm tightening. "The walls," he said, his voice weak but urgent. His eyes flicked toward the glowing cracks that snaked along the stone. "They're connected. It's spreading." I didn't understand what he meant, but there wasn't time to ask. The tapping stopped suddenly, replaced by a low, guttural rumble that seemed to shake the ground beneath us. The walls pulsed once, twice, and then something moved in the darkness. It wasn't like the figures we'd seen before. Not exactly. This thing was larger, its form shifting and amorphous, as though the shadows themselves had coalesced into a single living entity. Its surface shimmered faintly, reflecting the dim light of our flashlights, and its movements were slow but deliberate, each step sending a tremor through the chamber. Mia screamed, the sound piercing and raw, and bolted toward the far side of the room. Her flashlight beam bounced wildly, illuminating glimpses of the creature as it followed her, its form stretching and twisting, its edges dissolving into the darkness like smoke. "Go!" I shouted, pulling Ben toward the opposite side of the chamber. "Enua, suhulin kanti." My legs felt like lead, each step a battle against the crushing weight of fear and exhaustion. The creature's movements were slow, but deliberate, its presence filling the space like an ever-expanding void. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The thought of seeing it again, of watching it shift and grow and devour the light, was more than I could bear. We reached a far wall, where a narrow crevice split the stone. It wasn't much, barely wide enough to squeeze through, but it was something. I shoved Ben toward it, my hands trembling as I pushed him inside. He grunted, his body twisting awkwardly as he squeezed through, and I turned back to Mia. "Mia, this way," I shouted, but she didn't respond. Her flashlight beam had vanished, swallowed by the darkness, and her screams had stopped. The creature shifted, its form rippling as it turned toward me. My chest tightened, the weight of its gaze pressing down on me, pinning me in place. The air around it shimmered, distorting like heat waves, and I felt the same invasive presence I'd felt near the sphere, clawing at the edges of my mind, unraveling my thoughts. I stumbled backward, my hands groping for the edges of the crevice, and dragged myself inside. The stone scraped against my arms and legs, the narrow space crushing. But it was better than the alternative. I crawled forward, my breath ragged, my flashlight beam flickering weakly as the tapping resumed, echoing behind me, relentless and unyielding. The crevice stretched on forever, or at least it felt that way. The walls were so tight that every scrape of my shoulders against the jagged rock sent a sharp jolt of pain up my spine. My flashlight flickered erratically, barely illuminating more than a few feet ahead of me, and the air was thick with dust and the metallic tang of the mine. Behind me, the tapping continued, steady and relentless, like a heartbeat that wasn't my own. Ben's ragged breaths echoed ahead, uneven and shallow, but he kept moving, pulling himself through the narrow passage with a determination that seemed almost mechanical. I wanted to call out to him, to tell him to slow down, but the words caught in my throat. The sound of the tapping wasn't fading. It was getting louder. It was getting louder. The walls around us began to change. The jagged rock gave way to something smoother, darker, the faint sheen of moisture, reflecting the flicker of my light. Symbols appeared again, etched into the stone in sharp, angular lines that seemed to writhe and twist as my flashlight passed over them. They pulsed faintly, the same sickly light that had radiated from the sphere. And with each pulse, the tapping seemed to grow closer, more insistent. "Ben," I rasped, my voice cracking. "We need to stop, just for a second." He didn't respond. His silhouette was barely visible now, his movements jerky and uneven, like a puppet dragged forward by unseen strings. My chest tightened, a deep primal fear clawing at the edges of my mind. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The passage opened abruptly into a cavern smaller than the ones before, but no less suffocating. The air here was freezing, each breath burning my throat, and the floor was slick with a dark, viscous liquid that clung to my boots as I stepped forward. The walls were lined with more of the glowing symbols, their light pulsing in time, with the tapping that now filled the cavern, reverberating through the air, the stone, my skull. Ben was standing in the center of the room, his back to me, his flashlight dangling limply from one hand. His other hand was stretched out toward the far wall, where something large and jagged jutted out from the stone. It was a door, or at least, it looked like one. The surface was carved with more of the twisting symbols, their glow brighter here, almost blinding. The edges of the door were jagged, as though it had been ripped from the surrounding rock, and the space beyond it was pitch black, a void that seemed to swallow the light entirely. "Ben," I said again, louder this time. My voice echoed through the cavern, but he didn't turn. His hand hovered inches from the surface of the door, trembling slightly, and I could see his chest heaving, his breaths shallow and uneven. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to suck all the air from the room. The glow of the symbols dimmed, their light flickering weakly, and for a moment it felt as though the entire cavern was holding its breath. Then the voice returned. "Even deceptively, la, it wasn't like before. The review, don't chilly. It wasn't a guttural growl or a distorted whisper. This was clear, sharp, and resonant. A single word that echoed through the cavern with an intensity that made my ears ring. Come." Ben's hand moved toward the door. his fingers brushing against the glowing surface. I lunged forward, my boots slipping on the slick floor, and grabbed his arm, pulling him back with all the strength I could muster. He stumbled, his flashlight falling from his hand and clattering to the ground, its beam spinning wildly. "What are you doing?" I shouted, my voice breaking. "You can't touch it." He turned to me then, and the look in his eyes froze me in place. Moi, in place. They weren't his eyes anymore. The pale blue I'd known was gone, replaced by a sickly yellow glow that pulsed faintly in time with the light of the symbols. His expression was blank, empty, as though whatever had made him him was gone, replaced by something hollow and alien. "I have to," he said, his voice flat, mechanical. "It's the only way." "No," I said, shaking my head, my grip tightening on his arm. "We're leaving. Right now. We can't." The ground beneath us trembled violently, cutting me off. The glow of the symbols flared brighter, their light searing into my vision, and the tapping resumed, louder than ever, a deafening cacophony that drowned out everything else. The door began to move, the jagged edges grinding against the stone as it slid open, revealing more of the endless void beyond. From the darkness, something emerged. It wasn't a figure. It wasn't a creature. It was a presence, a vast, incomprehensible force that pressed against my mind, filling my thoughts with a weight so crushing that I could barely breathe. The air grew colder, the light from the symbols flickering and dying, and I felt the edges of my vision blur as the thing in the darkness reached for us. Ben wrenched free of my grip, his movements sharp and unnatural, and stepped toward the door. "It needs me," he said, his voice distant, disconnected. "I have to finish it." "No, no," I screamed, lunging after him, but the force from the void slammed into me like a wave, knocking me to the ground. My flashlight spun out of my hand, its beam extinguishing as it hit the stone. I scrambled to my feet, but it was too late. Ben was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and the door slammed shut behind him with a final deafening crack. The tapping stopped again, and the cavern was silent. The symbols on the walls dimmed and faded, their light winking out one by one, until there was nothing but darkness. I was alone. And for a long moment, I just stood there, my chest heaving, my body trembling, the weight of the mind pressed down on me, suffocating, crushing, and I felt tears sting my eyes as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Ben was gone. En van wir stuurden the day. Mia was gone, and I was alone, trapped in the heart of something I couldn't begin to understand. Then, faint and distant, I heard it again. The tapping, slow and steady, coming from the direction of the door. It was softer now, almost inviting, and I felt a cold dread settle over me as I realized it wasn't calling for me anymore. It was calling for someone else.